What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. There's been a lot of talk about 3 SEC teams making it to the college football playoff. There were even some talks about 4 teams making it before Ole Miss lost to LSU. Is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? No. I'm going to show you exactly what would have to happen for 3 SEC teams to make it into the college football playoff. There's really only one thing that I think is going to hang this up, that's going to keep it from happening if it plays out the way the SEC needs it to play out. So let's start there. This is the best case scenario for the SEC. Alabama wins out. They win the SEC championship. So they will face Georgia, because Georgia will go 12-0, have a close win over Tennessee, and then Tennessee finishes 11-1, with that Georgia loss being their only loss. This is the best case scenario for the SEC. LSU, if they wind up winning the SEC with 2 losses, I don't think they're guaranteed to get in. As crazy as that sounds, they would have 2 losses. You'd have a Georgia team with 1 loss, a Tennessee team maybe with 1 loss that beat LSU head-to-head. It will be tough, I think, for LSU to be guaranteed a spot. Now, they would have a shot. It really just depends on what happens with everything else. And then I feel like it's better for Georgia to beat Tennessee than it is for Tennessee to beat Georgia, because Tennessee is going to have that really good win against LSU. They also have the win over Pittsburgh in the non-conference. A lot of this also will depend on how all those teams finish. If Oregon winds up not losing another game, if they wind up winning the Pac-12, then it might actually be better for Tennessee to beat Georgia, potentially, because then Georgia, they can look back on that big win over Oregon, and they're not going to drop below Oregon in the rankings. So I think it really would be about the same regardless of who wins that game, Georgia and Tennessee. But we're going to say, because Tennessee would have the big win over Alabama, big win over LSU, Pittsburgh in the non-conference, plus the SEC East, I think it would benefit the SEC for Georgia to beat Tennessee. And then, of course, Alabama has to win against Georgia in the SEC championship. That's going to get them in with just the 1 loss. And all 3 of these teams, their losses would have come to each other, meaning you lose to a top 5 team, and that's your only loss. And Alabama would have a win over Georgia. Georgia would have a win over Tennessee. Tennessee would have a win over Alabama. So, the resumes would be very nice for all 3 of these teams, and all 3 of them would be in the conversation for the college football playoff. But would they get in? That's the question. And it'll depend on a lot of other things. So first of all, I think the most likely thing that's going to happen is Ohio State or Michigan. One of them is going to go undefeated. That winner will be in the college football playoff. The loser, I think, would be behind all 3 of those SEC teams. Alabama for sure is in. They're the champions of the conference. They only have 1 loss on the road at Tennessee. They're in, no doubt about it. Then you look at Georgia and Tennessee, and you compare their resumes to the loser of this game. I think Georgia and Tennessee would both be ahead of these 2 teams, and I feel pretty confident on that. Notre Dame not being good really hurts Ohio State. If they were that team, Michigan does not have a very tough non-conference schedule at all. In fact, it's one of the worst non-conference schedules for any Power 5 team. It was really, really bad. So I think when you stack up the resumes to Georgia or Tennessee, the loser of this game is not going to be in. And I feel confident in that. Pretty confident. More confident on Michigan not getting in than Ohio State. Ohio State might have a little bit better of an argument. I don't see it, though. I still think the 2 SEC teams would be ahead of them if they were to lose. But yeah, if we're wanting best case scenario, SEC, they want Ohio State to win out and win the Big Ten. The Pac-12 champ would also be behind Tennessee and Georgia, and I feel confident on that. There's really, Oregon, they already lost to Georgia. They got blown out. I don't think USC potentially would be ranked ahead of them. They don't have a very tough non-conference schedule. The resume just not going to be there. And so I feel confident that the Pac-12, they're already out of the way. We don't have to worry about the Pac-12 in terms of getting 3 SEC teams in. These 3 SEC teams will be ahead of every team in the Pac-12. Now let's get to the 2 teams that could cause some problems for the SEC getting 3 teams in. That's TCU and Clemson. Both of them probably need to lose 1 game. And I say probably because I don't know for sure what the committee would do. I think the committee is going to look at, if it plays out the way I laid out, they're going to look at Georgia and they're going to look at Tennessee, and they're probably going to say that Georgia and Tennessee are better teams than TCU and Clemson. That's just what the committee is going to say. But can they? Will they really do that? Would they really put a one-loss non-champion, a team that did not win their conference championship, would they put them ahead of an undefeated Power 5 conference champion? I just don't think they're going to do that. I don't know that they would say that these teams, TCU and Clemson, are better than Tennessee or Georgia. But I think Tennessee and Clemson would deserve to get in because they would have gone undefeated, won their conference championship. That will be really interesting. If it does come down to that, what does the committee do? Do they really look at who they think is the better team, or are you going to fall back on the resume and all of that type of stuff? So that would be a really interesting debate. But I believe that TCU and Clemson, if they were undefeated, would be ahead of Georgia and Tennessee. So you're going to need both of these teams to lose a game. TCU, I kind of think, will lose a game. I mean, they're a really good team, but you look at the rest of their schedule, they're probably going to trip up somewhere. Then you have the Big 12 championship. I feel like TCU will probably lose one game. Clemson, on the other hand, that's where you've got a big issue, I think, because they're going to be favored in the rest of their games. Who's going to beat them? They go on the road to face Notre Dame. Notre Dame has not been very good. The ACC championship game is not going to be tough. The Coastal Division is terrible. The most likely loss could be on the road at South Carolina, and I believe they do play them on the road this year. That's a rivalry game. That's a game that you never know about. I know Clemson has dominated as of late, but South Carolina's got a pretty good football team this year. They're now in the top 25. They've gotten some decent wins. I think Clemson would still be favored, and actually, as I record this, I'm looking, and they play at Clemson. That makes that game even tougher. So, yeah, that's your problem. If you're wanting to get 3 SEC teams into the college football playoff, I think what I talked about on the first graphic could happen. I think Alabama could win the SEC. We could have Georgia and Tennessee sitting there with just one loss. That is a very realistic possibility, and that could happen. But Clemson is going to be the team that gets in the way, and that's why I think it's very unlikely that 3 SEC teams will get into the college football playoff. But if this does happen, if TCU loses, if Clemson loses, I think this is how the playoff would look. I think you'd have Ohio State or Michigan, whichever team goes undefeated. I'm just going to say Ohio State because they're favored. The Buckeyes would go to number 1. An undefeated team, I believe they would be number 1. Alabama, because they won the SEC, would be number 2. I think Georgia, because they have the head-to-head over Tennessee, would be at number 3. Then you'd have Tennessee at number 4. And behind them, then maybe you would have Michigan or Oregon if they don't lose any more games. But yeah, I feel like these would be the 4 teams if it does play out like I talked about. But that is going to be the issue. Clemson losing a game, that is what I think is probably going to keep the SEC from getting 3 teams into the college football playoff. I don't really see any way you can get 4 teams in now. Because Ole Miss, let's say they went out, well, then Alabama's going to have 2 losses, and so then Alabama's out of it. So, yeah, there's no way, not even a crazy scenario where you could get 4 teams in. Now, let's say LSU wins out. They win the SEC. Ole Miss wins out. They have 1 loss. You'd have a 1-loss Ole Miss, a 1-loss Georgia, a 1-loss Tennessee. LSU with 2 losses, would they be the conference champion? I mean, that would be a crazy scenario that I guess could happen. But I don't think all 4 of them would get in that scenario. So, anyways, a lot of talk about how 3 teams, or could 3 teams from the SEC get into the college football playoff, and I've just showed you exactly how it could happen, but why it's really not all that likely.